June 27th, 1941. 5 days after Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, 300 miles inside Soviet territory, a column of German panzers and mechanized infantry rumbled eastward through the dust of a conquered nation, their commanders confident that Moscow would fall within weeks. They had crushed Poland in days, France in weeks. The Soviet Union, they believed, would be no different. Then they heard it, a sound unlike anything the Luftwaffe made, a deep guttural roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. 5 aircraft appeared over the horizon, flying so low their propellers nearly touched the treetops. Barrel-shaped fuselages, stubby wings, a distinctive hump behind the cockpit that gave them an almost prehistoric appearance. The German tank commanders barely had time to identify them before the first rockets streaked from beneath those wings. This was the combat debut of the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, an aircraft that would become the most produced military plane in history, an aircraft Joseph Stalin would call as essential to the Red Army as air and bread, an aircraft German soldiers would come to know by many names: Flying Tank, Concrete Bird, Iron Gustav. But the name that would echo across frozen steppes and burning wheat fields, the name whispered in fear by Wehrmacht troops from Stalingrad to Berlin, was Schwarzer Tod, Black Death. This is the story of how Soviet industrial determination and tactical evolution transformed an initially vulnerable ground attack aircraft into the most feared weapon in the skies of the Eastern Front. How armour plate became aircraft structure. How concentrated firepower met German armour at its weakest point. And how the thunderous roar of Mikulin engines became the sound of inevitable defeat for the Third Reich. The concept of an armoured ground attack aircraft wasn't new to Soviet military thinking. As early as the 1930s, designers like Dmitry Pavlovich Grigorovich had experimented with armoured biplanes, the TSH-1 and TSH-2. But Soviet engines of that era simply lacked the power to lift heavy armour into the air while maintaining combat effectiveness. The result was a series of promising concepts that never left the ground. In 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe and German aggression threatened the peace, Sergei Ilyushin approached Joseph Stalin with a radical proposition: a flying tank. An aircraft with armour protection integrated into its very structure, not bolted on as an afterthought. An aircraft designed from the ground up to fly low, absorb punishment, and deliver devastating firepower against ground targets. Stalin, understanding that modern war would be decided by combined arms operations, approved the concept without the usual design competition. The faith he placed in Ilyushin would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions of the war. What Ilyushin and his team at the Central Design Bureau created was revolutionary. The TSK B-55 prototype featured an armoured shell weighing 1,500 pounds that protected the crew, engine, radiators, and fuel tank. But here was the genius. Unlike other aircraft where armour was dead weight that degraded performance, Ilyushin designed the armour as a load-bearing structural element. The steel became the fuselage itself, supporting the wings and tail section. This saved enormous weight and made the concept viable. When the TSK B-55 first flew on October 2, 1939, it shocked observers. An aircraft could be armoured heavily enough to shrug off ground fire and still maintain reasonable flight characteristics. The prototype won the government competition against Sukhoi's Su-6 and received the designation BSH-2, Bronirovanny Sturmovik, Armoured Ground Attacker. But testing revealed problems. The original Mikulin AM-35 engine, designed for high-altitude operations, was underpowered at the low altitudes where ground attack aircraft operated. The BSH-2 was overweight, sluggish, couldn't reach required speeds or ranges. Ilyushin went back to the drawing board. The solution was the TSK B-57, a redesigned variant with a more powerful Mikulin AM-38 engine, producing 1,682 horsepower. This engine was optimized specifically for low-level operations, with a single-speed supercharger instead of the AM-35's two-speed unit. The unnecessary complexity was eliminated. Power where it mattered was maximized. The TSK B-57 also went from 2 seats to 1, reducing weight further. When it first flew on October 12, 1940, the transformation was complete. The production aircraft passed state acceptance trials in March 1941 and was redesignated IL-2. Orders flooded the factories. Production began at 4 facilities, with deliveries to operational units commencing in May 1941. But by the time Hitler launched Barbarossa on June 22nd, only 249 IL-2s had been built. Of these, a mere 70 were in actual service. Worse, only 20 were stationed with frontier military districts that would face the initial German onslaught. Their pilots had minimal training. The tactical doctrines that would eventually make the Sturmovik devastating hadn't been developed. No one knew yet what this aircraft could really do. The IL-2 that entered service in 1941 was a single-seat, single-engine, low-wing monoplane, 11.6 metres long with a wingspan of 14.6 metres. The armoured tub ranged from 4 to 8 millimetres thick, with some sections reaching 12 millimetres. This wasn't ordinary steel. Soviet metallurgists had developed a special alloy specifically for the IL-2, with varying thickness by location to maximise protection, while minimising weight. 780 kilograms of armour wrapped around everything vital. The pilots sat behind 5 to 6 centimetres of armoured glass. The AM-38 engine, radiators, fuel tanks, all encased in steel. Even the oil cooler had armoured protection. The engine itself was a masterpiece of low-altitude performance, 18 cylinders in a radial configuration, water-cooled, producing 1,700 horsepower at takeoff and maintaining 1,500 horsepower at 2,500 feet. Unlike German inline engines with vulnerable coolant systems, the AM-38's radial configuration meant battle damage to one cylinder didn't necessarily doom the engine. The armament was formidable for 1941. Two 20mm Schwack cannons and two 7.62mm Schuss machine guns mounted in the wings. External hardpoints could carry 8 82mm RS-82 rockets or up to 600 kilograms of bombs. The RS-82 rocket was particularly innovative. Soviet designers had been experimenting with air-to-ground rockets since the mid-1930s, making the IL-2 one of the first mass-produced aircraft designed to employ rocket weaponry from the start. But the early IL-2 had a fatal flaw. No rear defence, no gunner to protect against attacks from behind. This decision, made to save weight and improve performance, would cost Soviet pilots dearly in the opening months of the war. June 22, 1941, 3:30 a.m. Along a 2,000-mile front, German artillery opened fire. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, had begun. 3 million German troops, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, all aimed at destroying the Soviet Union in a single lightning campaign. The Soviet Air Force, the VVS, was caught completely unprepared. In the first hours, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. In the first month, over 4,000 Soviet aircraft of all types were lost. The 4th Sturmovik Aviation Regiment, one of the few units equipped with IL-2s, lost 55 of its 65 aircraft. The numbers were catastrophic. Surviving IL-2 pilots found themselves thrust into desperate missions with minimal support. Early tactics were crude, approaching targets in groups of 3 to 5 aircraft, attacking one at a time from altitudes of 20 to 200 metres, expending all ammunition and ordnance in a single pass, then running for home while German fighters hunted them. With no rear gunner and no mutual defensive support, loss rates were astronomical. One aircraft lost for every 9 combat sorties in those early desperate days. Pilots complained that the 20mm cannons lacked penetrating power against German armour. The Panzer III and Vieh tanks that spearheaded the Blitzkrieg had frontal armour that could withstand 20mm fire. Attacks had to be made from the sides or rear, requiring pilots to fly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The psychological strain was immense, but something else was becoming clear. When IL-2s did get hit, they kept flying. German machine gun fire that would shred a Messerschmitt or Stuka bounced off the armoured tub. 20mm cannon shells that would explode a normal aircraft's engine compartment were absorbed by the thick steel plating. One IL-2 returned from a July mission with over 40 hits, from machine guns and light cannons. The pilot was uninjured. The engine still ran. The aircraft was repaired and flew again 3 days later. As German forces drove deeper into Soviet territory, Stalin's production facilities faced catastrophe. Factories near Moscow and western cities were within range of German bombers. The decision was made to evacuate entire manufacturing plants east of the Ural Mountains. In one of the most extraordinary industrial relocations in history, Soviet workers dismantled factories, loaded equipment onto trains, and rebuilt production facilities hundreds of miles to the east. All while the war raged. IL-2 production ceased for 2 months during this evacuation. When the factories came back online, production was slow. 1 aircraft per day, maybe 2. Stalin was furious. In autumn 1941, as German panzers approached Moscow's outskirts, Stalin sent a telegram to the factory managers Schenkman and Tretyakov. The message was characteristically blunt. "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs IL-2 aircraft like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces 1 IL-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds 1 or 2 MiG-3s daily. It is a mockery of our country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience and demand that you manufacture more ILs. This is my final warning." Stalin. The threat was clear. Produce or face consequences. Under this pressure, production increased dramatically, but the aircraft's tactical employment remained problematic. Then Stalin received a letter. A frontline IL-2 pilot wrote directly to the Soviet leader, describing the desperate vulnerability of single-seat Sturmoviks to German fighter attacks. He begged for a rear gunner position, someone to defend the aircraft during those agonizing moments after an attack run when speed was low and German fighters pounced. Stalin ordered Ilyushin to modify the design immediately. By August 1942, the IL-2M began rolling off production lines. The 2-seat variant featured an extended canopy accommodating a gunner manning a 12.7mm UBT heavy machine gun. The rear position wasn't protected by the armoured tub. That would have required a complete redesign. Gunners sat in a wooden rear fuselage with minimal protection. Their survival rate would be horrific, 4 times the casualty rate of pilots, but the defensive fire proved invaluable. German fighters could no longer attack with impunity. The IL-2M also received upgraded weaponry. The 20mm Schusswaffen cannons were replaced with high-velocity 23mm WWII cannons. These weapons fired armour-piercing incendiary rounds at higher muzzle velocity, giving them significantly better penetration against German armour. The engine was upgraded to the AM-30F, producing 1,750 horsepower. But perhaps most important were the tactical lessons Soviet pilots and commanders were learning through brutal experience. The Soviet Air Force Research Institute analysed combat reports and survival data. They determined that single-pass attacks from low altitude made Sturmoviks sitting ducks. Higher approach altitudes were needed to increase battle efficiency. Multiple runs over the target were required to inflict significant accurate damage. Most critically, IL-2s needed to provide mutual defensive support. The answer came in 1943, the Circle of Death. 8 Sturmoviks would form a defensive circle over the battlefield, each aircraft protecting the one ahead with its forward-firing machine guns. Individual IL-2s would peel away from the circle, make an attack run, then rejoin the formation. The circular pattern meant German fighters attacking from behind would face concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. Ground targets would face sustained attacks for 15 to 30 minutes as aircraft took turns making runs. The tactic was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. It transformed the IL-2 from vulnerable individual attackers into a coordinated weapon system that was far more than the sum of its parts. At Stalingrad in late 1942, the Circle of Death proved its worth. The city had become a meat grinder where German and Soviet forces fought house to house, room to room, in the most brutal urban combat of the war. Hitler demanded victory at any cost. Stalin ordered not one step back. In November, as winter closed in, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack aimed at encircling the German Sixth Army in the city. Over 1,400 aircraft participated, a third of them IL-2s. White-painted Sturmoviks skimmed across the frozen steppe at altitudes below 20 metres, so low German radar couldn't detect them until they were already attacking. The weather was atrocious, snow and fog limiting visibility to metres. This grounded the Luftwaffe, but Soviet pilots, trained in all-weather operations, pressed their attacks. Sturmoviks hammered German armour, artillery positions, supply columns. The encirclement succeeded. 300,000 German troops were trapped in Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe attempted to resupply them by air, flying in ammunition, food, and fuel aboard Junkers Ju-52 transports. IL-2 pilots were ordered to destroy this air bridge. On January 26, 1943, 2 Sturmoviks appeared over the German-held rail station at Malorossiskaya. 4 trains sat on the tracks, laden with supplies desperately needed by the dying Sixth Army. The IL-2s attacked in a single devastating pass. Rockets and bombs tore through the trains, explosions ripped through ammunition cars, fuel tanks erupted in massive fireballs, a black mushroom cloud rose thousands of feet. When the smoke cleared, all 4 trains were destroyed. The tracks were so damaged they couldn't be repaired. German soldiers scrambled, but there was nothing to be done. 2 aircraft, 4 trains, tons of ammunition, and fuel gone in seconds. More attacks followed. At the German airfield at Salsk, IL-2s caught transport aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. 7 lightning strikes destroyed 72 German aircraft on the ground. The air supply system collapsed. The Sixth Army starved. On February 2, 1943, the last German troops in Stalingrad surrendered. 9 10,000 survivors marched into captivity. The psychological impact of Stalingrad on the Wehrmacht was immense. But the greatest test was yet to come. July 1943. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the German-Soviet front line, 90 miles deep and 160 miles wide. Hitler believed a successful attack here could restore German fortunes on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel would employ the latest German weapons: Tiger and Panther tanks with thick sloped armour, Ferdinand tank destroyers mounting 88mm cannons, Focke-Wulf 190 fighters and Junkers, Ju-87G Stukas with 37mm cannons. The Germans assembled 900,000 troops, 2,700 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. It would be the largest armoured offensive in history. Soviet intelligence knew it was coming. They prepared accordingly. 6 lines of defence, trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions in the heaviest concentration ever assembled, and 6,000 aircraft, a third of them Sturmoviks. The Battle of Kursk would be the IL-2's defining moment. Soviet aviation engineers had developed a new weapon specifically for Kursk, the PT-AR B-25 1.5 anti-tank aviation bombs, shaped charge bomblets weighing 5.5 pounds with 3-pound explosive charges. Each IL-2 could carry up to 192 PTABs in 4 external dispensers or 220 in internal wing bays. The shaped charge could penetrate the relatively thin top armour of any German tank. Tigers, Panthers, even the mighty Ferdinands, all were vulnerable from above. The Germans didn't know about PTABs, they were about to find out. July 5, 1943. Dawn. The German offensive began. Massive artillery barrages, waves of bombers. Then the panzers rolled forward. For the first day, German forces made slow, grinding progress against fanatical Soviet resistance. By the second day, IL-2s were arriving in force. Groups of 20 to 30 Sturmoviks, flying in their defensive circles, appeared over German armoured columns. The PTABs fell like deadly rain. Each bomblet tumbled as it fell, stabilised by a small fin. On impact, the shaped charge focused explosive force into a jet of superheated metal that burned through armour like a cutting torch. A direct hit on a tank's engine compartment or turret roof meant instant destruction. Even near misses could damage treads, optics, external fuel tanks. German tank commanders had never experienced anything like it. The attacks were relentless. One wave of Sturmoviks would finish their runs and depart. Minutes later, another wave arrived. The circle of death pattern meant ground targets faced continuous attack. There was no respite, no time to regroup. Soviet records claimed dramatic successes. On July 7th, IL-2s reportedly destroyed 70 tanks of the German 9th Panzer Division in just 20 minutes. Another attack claimed 270 tanks of the 3rd Panzer Division destroyed in 2 hours. A 4-hour assault allegedly wiped out 240 tanks of the 17th Panzer Division. These numbers were almost certainly exaggerated. Post-war analysis of German records shows total tank losses at Kursk were nowhere near Soviet claims. The vast majority of German armour losses, around 95 to 98%, came from anti-tank guns, mines, artillery and mechanical breakdown, not air attack. But the psychological impact of the IL-2 attacks was real and devastating. German troops called the experience a steel avalanche. The sound of Sturmoviks diving to attack, engines roaring, rockets screaming, cannon fire hammering, created terror among ground forces. Radio intercepts recorded German troops shouting "Schwarzer Tod," Black Death, as they scrambled for cover. The nickname stuck. Wehrmacht soldiers developed a healthy fear of that distinctive engine sound. The deep guttural roar of the AM-38F at low altitude. The thunder of propeller tips approaching supersonic speeds during dive attacks. Veterans learned to identify IL-2s by sound alone, and new survival meant finding cover immediately. Some German troops developed what medical officers called Sturmovik fever, physical symptoms of stress, nausea, trembling, appearing when IL-2s were reported in the area. The aircraft had achieved what few weapons ever do. It had become a psychological weapon as effective as its physical firepower. Beyond the PTABs, IL-2s carried other weapons. The RS-132 rocket, larger and more powerful than the earlier RL-82, could carry either a shaped charge warhead for tanks or a high-explosive warhead for buildings and fortifications. The 23mm cannons were brutally effective against soft-skinned vehicles, artillery positions and infantry in the open. Each cannon fired at 400 rounds per minute, armor-piercing incendiary rounds travelling at 900 meters per second. A 2-second burst put more than a dozen projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. Everything from half-tracks to supply trucks to artillery tractors could be shredded in seconds. IL-2 pilots developed specific attack profiles for different targets. Against armoured columns, they would approach from the side or rear where armour was weakest, diving at 30 degrees from altitude, releasing PTABs from as low as 300 feet. Against troop concentrations, they would make multiple passes with cannons and machine guns, the sustained fire pinning infantry in the open, while bombs finished the job. Against airfields, they would approach at treetop level to avoid radar detection, then climb sharply and dive on parked aircraft. The versatility made Sturmoviks invaluable for combined arms operations. By the end of the Battle of Kursk in mid-July, the German offensive had failed completely. Army Group Center had suffered 300,000 casualties. Over half their tanks were destroyed or disabled. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk forward, the Red Army would advance continuously until they reached Berlin, and the IL-2 would be there for every major operation. Operation Bagration, June 1944, the 3rd anniversary of Barbarossa. Stalin planned the ultimate revenge, a massive offensive to liberate Belarus and destroy Army Group Center. Over 6,000 Soviet aircraft participated, 2,000 of them Sturmoviks. The tactics had evolved further. IL-2s now operated in close coordination with ground forces through forward air controllers. Radio-equipped officers with frontline units would call in strikes on specific targets: German strongpoints, tank concentrations, artillery batteries. The Sturmoviks would arrive within minutes, delivering precision strikes that enabled Red Army units to advance. Soviet pilot Yuri Kukrikov, who flew IL-2s throughout the war, described the aircraft with obvious affection. It was an excellent aircraft for those times. We carried 600 kilograms of bombs, 8 rockets, 323mm shells, and 1,800 rounds for the machine guns. The wings were tough. If a fuel tank was hit, carbon dioxide canisters would fill the empty space, preventing vapor and combustion. The sealer would fill holes. Fuel wouldn't leak out. The engine was the most vulnerable part, but even then, the radial configuration meant you could lose cylinders and keep flying. The German advance on Berlin began in January 1945 as the Red Army crossed the Oder and Neisse rivers. In the northern sector, where terrain was marshy and unsuitable for tanks or artillery, the Sturmovik became the only means of tactical support. Ground controllers provided precise coordinates. IL-2s delivered surgical strikes against entrenched positions. By April 1945, as Soviet forces battled into Berlin itself, IL-2s were supporting operations street by street, building by building. The hammer and sickle flag would be raised over the Reichstag on May 2, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The statistics of IL-2 operations defied comprehension. Over 36,000 IL-2s produced during the war, more than any other military aircraft in history. Some sources claim actual production exceeded 40,000. At peak production, Soviet factories completed 1 Sturmovik every 90 minutes around the clock. The Kubyshev factory, evacuated from Moscow in 1941, was producing over 400 aircraft per month by 1944. Soviet losses were staggering. Official records claim nearly 12,000 IL-2s lost during the war, around 30% of total Soviet combat aircraft losses. Some historians believe the true number was twice that. In early 1942, loss rates approached 1 aircraft per 12 sorties. By 1943, with improved tactics and the 2-seat configuration, this improved to 1 per 26 sorties. But even with terrible losses, production always exceeded attrition. The factories kept building, replacement pilots kept arriving with better training than their predecessors. By 1944, Soviet IL-2 pilots averaged over 100 hours in type before entering combat. German pilots by that time were lucky to have 30 hours total flight time. The industrial and training advantage was overwhelming. What made the IL-2 effective wasn't just its armour or weapons, it was the complete system, the aircraft itself, the tactics developed through brutal experience, the industrial capacity to replace losses, the training pipeline producing skilled pilots, the forward air control system enabling rapid response to ground requests. Combined, these elements created a weapon system that the Germans couldn't counter. They tried. Specialized Luftwaffe units were formed specifically to hunt IL-2s. German aces racked up impressive kill counts against Sturmoviks. One pilot claimed over 50 IL-2s destroyed, but for every Sturmovik shot down, 2 more appeared. The mathematics were inexorable. Germany had entered the war with a qualitative advantage in aircraft and pilot skill, but industrial warfare is ultimately about numbers. The side that can produce more, train more, and sustain longer will win. The IL-2 embodied Soviet industrial philosophy. Relatively simple construction mixing wood and metal, capable of being manufactured with semi-skilled labour, designed for ease of maintenance in field conditions, brutally effective at its intended mission. The armour design influenced future aircraft. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the American close support aircraft that entered service in the 1970s, uses a similar armoured bathtub protecting the pilot and critical systems. The titanium armour is literally a structural element, just as Ilyushin pioneered. The concept of the heavily armoured ground attacker remains valid even in the jet age. The successor to the IL-2, the IL-10, appeared too late to see significant action. Only about 6,000 were produced, with around 150 seeing combat before Germany surrendered. The IL-10 was essentially a redesigned Sturmovik with improved aerodynamics, all-metal construction, and a more powerful AM-42 engine. It would serve in Soviet and Allied air forces into the 1950s, seeing action in Korea where it received the NATO codename Beast. But it was overshadowed by its predecessor. The IL-2 remained the symbol of Soviet air power. German accounts of the IL-2 evolved dramatically over the course of the war. In 1941, Luftwaffe reports described the Sturmovik as slow, unmaneuverable, not a significant threat. By 1943, German intelligence assessments painted a very different picture. Exceptional structural strength, devastating firepower, increasingly effective tactics, significant threat at all altitudes. By 1945, the assessments were stark. Best ground attack aircraft of the war, combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. Post-war, several German commanders were asked about the IL-2. Their responses revealed grudging respect. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, who commanded the fighter forces, was particularly candid in a 1985 interview. "We made a terrible mistake dismissing them initially. We saw the heavy aircraft and assumed the Soviets didn't understand air combat. We were wrong. The Americans built what American industry could produce. The Soviets did the same. The IL-2 was designed around what Soviet factories could manufacture and what Soviet tactics required. Survivability, firepower, ease of production. They built over 36,000 while fighting for their survival. Each one required complex manufacturing, yet they produced them faster than we could destroy them. That's when you know you've lost. Not when the enemy has better weapons, but when they can replace losses faster than you can inflict them." The IL-2 represented that truth more than any other weapon. The psychological impact persisted long after the war. German veterans interviewed decades later still spoke of Sturmovik attacks with visible emotion. The sound of those engines, the sight of them coming in low, so low you could see the pilot's face, the rockets, the cannon fire like hammers, the feeling of absolute helplessness. You couldn't hide, couldn't run. All you could do was pray they didn't see you. The nickname Schwarzer Tod wasn't Soviet propaganda. That came from German soldiers who experienced the attacks and survived to tell about it. Soviet veterans had their own perspectives. Anna Yegorova, one of the few female Sturmovik pilots, described the aircraft with obvious pride. The IL-2 was peerless among combat airplanes. The Sturmovik produced a mighty roar that terrified the fascists as the aircraft attacked. They nicknamed it Black Death. In August 1944, Yegorova was shot down over Poland near the Magnusiu bridgehead. Terribly burned and wounded, she was captured by German troops. Even as they took her prisoner, she heard Sturmoviks diving nearby. Her captors shouted Schwarzer Tod, and ran for cover. That sound, that distinctive thunder. It followed the Wehrmacht from Stalingrad to Berlin. An audible reminder that the tide had turned, that Soviet industry had found its stride, that revenge for Barbarossa was coming. The production numbers themselves tell an extraordinary story. In 1941, only 249 IL-2s were built. In 1942, with factories still recovering from evacuation, production reached nearly 7,800. In 1943, over 11,000 rolled off the assembly lines. 1944 saw more than 10,000 produced. By the time production ended, over 36,000 IL-2s had been manufactured, not counting the IL-10 successor. Each aircraft required approximately 4,500 man-hours to build. The AN-38 engine alone contained over 2,000 individual components, machined to precise tolerances. The armoured tub required specialised steel alloys and forming techniques. The 23mm VIA cannons were complex weapons requiring precision manufacturing. Yet Soviet workers, many of them women who had never worked in factories before the war, assembled these aircraft with quality that met or exceeded peacetime standards. The ammunition production was equally impressive. Each IL-2 sortie required 600 cannon shells and several thousand machine gun rounds. With thousands of Sturmoviks flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded millions of rounds monthly. Soviet factories established during the war produced this ammunition, while simultaneously manufacturing shells for artillery, bullets for infantry, and rounds for tanks. The logistical achievement rivaled the aircraft production itself. Fuel consumption was enormous. Each Sturmovik burned approximately 150 gallons per sortie. The Red Army's advance across Eastern Europe required massive fuel supplies to keep aircraft flying, tank columns advancing, trucks moving supplies, all while German forces deliberately destroyed fuel depots and refineries during their retreat. Soviet logistics officers performed near miracles keeping the war machine supplied. The human cost behind the IL-2's success was staggering. Over 11,000 aircraft lost meant over 11,000 pilots killed, wounded, or captured. The rear gunners suffered even worse. Flying in an unarmoured position, exposed to fire from behind, they had casualty rates 4 times higher than pilots. Many gunners survived only a handful of missions, yet replacements kept volunteering. Soviet propaganda portrayed Sturmovik crews as heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Newspaper articles celebrated their victories. Posters showed IL-2s destroying German tanks. The message was clear. The fascist invaders would be destroyed. The motherland would be avenged. But behind the propaganda were young men, often teenagers, climbing into aircraft knowing their odds of survival were poor. The training pipeline struggled to keep pace with losses. Early in the war, pilots were rushed to frontline units with minimal preparation. By 1944, training had improved significantly, but the demand for pilots remained insatiable. Some flew until they were killed, some flew until they were too injured to continue. A few flew through the entire war and survived. Those survivors carried scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. In museums around the world today, only about a dozen IL-2s still exist. The scarcity is testament to how hard they were used. Unlike American or British aircraft that might be retired and preserved, Soviet Sturmoviks flew until they were destroyed or worn out beyond repair. At war's end, surviving aircraft were either scrapped or sold to Allied nations. A few ended up at the bottom of lakes or in remote crash sites. The restoration of even one IL-2 is an enormous undertaking. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington recovered an IL-2 that had been submerged for 50 years. The entire rear fuselage had rotted away. Museum specialists are rebuilding it using original factory techniques. researching Soviet manufacturing methods from wartime documents. The project has taken years and required translating hundreds of pages of Russian technical manuals. Flying examples are even rarer. In 2011, Russian restorers completed a flyable IL-2 for an American collector. Without access to original Klimov engines, they fitted an American Allison V1710. The sound isn't quite right, but seeing a Sturmovik in the air again, banking and diving as it did over Kursk, is profoundly moving. The legacy of the IL-2 extends far beyond statistics and museum displays. It proved that heavily armoured, close air support aircraft could be effective in modern warfare. That armour could be structural rather than dead weight. That industrial capacity matters as much as technological sophistication. That tactical evolution through experience can transform a weapon system from vulnerability to dominance. The Germans entered the war with arguably the world's best air force, superior training, combat experience from Spain and Poland, excellent aircraft, effective tactics. But they couldn't match Soviet industrial output, couldn't replace losses as quickly, couldn't adapt fast enough to Soviet tactical innovations. The IL-2 became the symbol of that inexorable grinding down. Every Sturmovik attack reminded German troops that they faced an enemy who would not quit, who could absorb terrible losses and keep fighting, who would eventually bury them under sheer weight of numbers. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be overstated. Weapons become legendary not just through their capabilities, but through the fear they inspire. The German Tiger tank, the American B-17 bomber, the British Spitfire fighter. These weapons achieved mythical status partly through propaganda, but also through genuine battlefield effectiveness and the dread they inspired in enemies. The IL-2 joined that pantheon. To Soviet soldiers, the flying infantryman was salvation. When Sturmoviks appeared overhead, you knew help had arrived. To German soldiers, Black Death was exactly that. An angel of death that could appear without warning, travelling so low that radar couldn't detect it until too late, delivering destruction with terrifying precision. The sound of that engine became a Pavlovian trigger. German troops would freeze, listening, trying to determine if those engines were coming closer. When they were, survival meant finding cover immediately. Foxholes, buildings, anything to get out of the open, because when the Sturmoviks arrived, you were about to experience hell. Stalin's telegram saying the IL-2 was as essential to the Red Army as air and bread was more than dramatic rhetoric. He understood that modern warfare required combined arms operations. Infantry needs artillery support, artillery needs ammunition, ammunition needs transportation, transportation needs protection, protection needs air supremacy, and ground forces need close air support. The IL-2 provided that support, not perfectly, not without terrible losses, but consistently and in overwhelming numbers. From Stalingrad to Berlin, whenever Soviet ground forces needed help, Sturmoviks answered. That reliability, that knowledge that air support would arrive, boosted morale and enabled aggressive operations. Compare this to German forces by 1944. The Luftwaffe had been bled white in the skies over Germany, defending against Allied bombers. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Pilot training collapsed. When Wehrmacht troops called for air support, it often never came. The psychological impact of fighting without air cover, while the enemy dominated the skies, was devastating. The IL-2 story is ultimately about how wars are won. Not through individual heroics, though those occurred. Not through technological superiority alone, though innovation mattered. Wars are won through the grinding application of resources, industrial capacity, trained personnel, sustainable logistics, adaptable tactics. The nation that can produce more, learn faster, and sustain longer will prevail. Soviet industry was inferior to German industry in precision manufacturing and technological sophistication. But Soviet factories could produce simpler designs in vast quantities, could relocate entire production facilities across a continent and resume operations, could train workers from scratch and achieve acceptable quality, could sustain production while the nation fought for survival. The IL-2 exemplified this approach, not the most sophisticated ground attack aircraft. The German Henschel HS-129 had heavier armour and bigger guns. The American P-47 Thunderbolt could carry bigger bomb loads, but neither was produced in remotely comparable numbers. Neither became the ubiquitous presence on the battlefield that the Sturmovik achieved. By late 1944, Soviet tactical doctrine assumed IL-2 availability. Ground commanders planned operations expecting Sturmovik support. Forward air controllers were standard in frontline units. Communication procedures for requesting airstrikes were rehearsed. The integration of air and ground operations reached levels unprecedented on the Eastern Front. German tactical doctrine had pioneered close air support with Stuka dive bombers in the early war, but as the Luftwaffe declined, that integration fell apart. By 1945, Wehrmacht forces often fought without any air support whatsoever. The tables had completely turned. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal but simple. If you lose 30% of your aircraft but replace 100%, you're getting stronger. If the enemy loses 10% of his aircraft but can only replace 20%, he's getting weaker. Over time, the advantage becomes overwhelming. The Soviet Union lost more IL-2s than Germany produced total ground attack aircraft during the entire war. But Soviet factories kept building. Soviet training schools kept graduating pilots. Soviet logistics kept delivering fuel and ammunition. German production, fuel supplies, and pilot training all collapsed in the final year. In January 1945, the Red Army had over 1,500 Sturmoviks operational. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 500 ground attack aircraft of all types on the entire Eastern Front. The disparity in training, maintenance, and logistics was even more extreme. Soviet pilots averaged 100 hours in type. German pilots were entering combat with 30 hours total time. Soviet aircraft had spare parts and maintenance support. German aircraft were cannibalized to keep others flying. The outcome was inevitable. The Red Army advance was supported by overwhelming air power. German attempts to mount counterattacks were slaughtered by Sturmoviks. Retreating columns were strafed continuously. Supply lines were interdicted. The Wehrmacht's collapse accelerated. When Soviet forces reached Berlin in April 1945, IL-2s supported the final assault, flying missions over the burning city, attacking the Reichstag, supporting troops fighting building to building. On May the 2nd, as the hammer and sickle was raised over the shattered Reichstag, Sturmovik circled overhead, a symbol of Soviet victory. A reminder that the Great Patriotic War had been won through sacrifice, determination, and industrial might. 75 years later, the IL-2 Sturmovik holds a unique place in military aviation history. Most produced combat aircraft ever, symbol of Soviet air power, the weapon that taught German soldiers to fear the skies. Veterans on both sides remembered it. Soviet pilots with pride, German soldiers with dread. The sound of that engine, the thunder of propellers, the scream of rockets, the hammer of cannon fire. Those sounds echoed across the Eastern Front for 4 years. They were the sounds of revenge for Barbarossa, the sounds of industrial warfare at its most brutal, the sounds of inevitable defeat for the Third Reich. When you visit aviation museums and see that distinctive profile, the barrel-shaped fuselage, the stubby wings, the greenhouse canopy, remember what it represents. Not just an aircraft, a complete weapon system, industrial capacity transformed into military power, tactical evolution through bloody experience, and the determination of a nation that refused to be conquered. The Germans laughed when they first encountered IL-2s in June 1941. The aircraft seemed crude, slow, vulnerable. By May 1945, there were no German soldiers left to laugh. Black Death had spoken, and the thunder of those Maculin engines had become the sound of liberation for millions, the sound of justice for the innocent, the sound of victory earned through sacrifice, the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, a flying tank that rewrote the rules of ground attack warfare, an aircraft as essential as air and bread, the most feared weapon in German skies, and the sound of thunder that followed the Wehrmacht from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. The story of the IL-2 doesn't end with victory in Europe. While celebrations erupted across the Soviet Union in May 1945, thousands of Sturmoviks remained operational. The Pacific Theatre still demanded attention. Japan had not surrendered, and Stalin had promised to enter the war against the Japanese Empire once Germany was defeated. August 9, 1945. Soviet forces launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, Japanese-occupied territory in northeastern China. Over 1.5 million troops poured across the border, supported by over 5,000 tanks and nearly 4,000 aircraft. Among them, hundreds of IL-2s that had fought across Europe were now being deployed against a very different enemy. The Japanese had fortified Manchuria extensively. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese military forces, had been depleted by transfers to the Pacific Islands, but still numbered over 600,000 troops. They occupied strong defensive positions, concrete bunkers, underground fortifications, artillery positions carved into hillsides. The terrain was different from the European steppes, mountains, dense forests, river valleys. Sturmovik tactics had to adapt yet again. The circle of death worked poorly in mountainous terrain where valleys channeled aircraft into predictable approach routes. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while less dense than German defences, was positioned to exploit these natural choke points. IL-2 pilots reverted to lower altitude approaches, using terrain masking to avoid detection until the last moment. The Japanese had nothing equivalent to German radar networks or the sophisticated fighter direction systems the Luftwaffe had developed, but they had fanatical determination and were willing to die in place rather than retreat. Bunker complexes that would have required days of artillery bombardment to reduce were instead attacked by Sturmoviks carrying high explosive bombs and rockets. The 23mm cannons proved devastating against the lighter Japanese armour. One engagement typified the Manchurian campaign. August 14th, 1945. A Soviet tank column advancing through a mountain pass encountered heavy fire from concealed positions. The Japanese had positioned anti-tank guns in caves overlooking the narrow road. Soviet tanks couldn't elevate their guns high enough to engage. Artillery couldn't get line of sight. The column was pinned down. Forward air controllers called for Sturmovik support. Within 20 minutes, 6 IL-2s arrived. The lead pilot assessed the situation, identifying gun positions by their muzzle flashes. The Sturmoviks attacked in pairs, diving from different angles to saturate the defensive positions. Rockets slammed into cave entrances, cannon fire raked the cliff faces, high explosive bombs triggered rock slides that buried entire positions. The attack lasted 8 minutes. When the Sturmoviks departed, Japanese resistance had ceased. The Soviet column resumed its advance. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across Manchuria. Wherever Soviet ground forces encountered strong resistance, Sturmoviks appeared to break the deadlock. The Manchurian campaign lasted only 3 weeks. By August 20th, organised Japanese resistance had collapsed. The speed of the Soviet advance shocked military observers. The Kwantung Army, which had terrorised China for years, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Over 500,000 Japanese troops surrendered. The IL-2 had proven its effectiveness in yet another theatre, against yet another enemy, in yet another type of terrain. But the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet invasion, forced Japan's surrender on August 15th. The war was finally over. The IL-2s that had flown from Moscow to Berlin and then to Manchuria were stood down. Their combat careers were finished, or so it seemed. The post-war years saw the Sturmovik's combat role continue in conflicts most Western observers never noticed. The Soviet Union transferred IL-2s to communist-aligned nations. Yugoslavia received significant numbers. Poland operated them. Czechoslovakia flew them. North Korea would eventually receive IL-10s, the successor model. These aircraft saw action in conflicts across Eastern Europe and Asia that the West largely ignored during the emerging Cold War. But perhaps more importantly, the IL-2 had established design principles that would influence military aviation for decades. The concept of the armoured ground attack aircraft survived into the jet age. The Soviet Union developed the Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoot in the 1970s, a jet-powered aircraft that carried forward the Sturmovik legacy. Twin engines for redundancy, armoured cockpit protecting the pilot, heavy weapon load, designed specifically for close air support in high-threat environments. The Americans, who had largely abandoned dedicated close air support aircraft after World War II, rediscovered the need during Vietnam. The A-1 Sky Raider, a propeller-driven aircraft developed in the 1940s, proved invaluable for supporting ground troops, but it lacked armour protection. Pilots were vulnerable to ground fire. The losses mounted. This led directly to the A-10 Thunderbolt II program. When Fairchild Republic designed the A-10 in the early 1970s, they studied the IL-2 extensively. The titanium bathtub protecting the pilot and critical systems was a direct descendant of Ilyushin's armoured tub concept. The philosophy of making armour a structural element rather than deadweight came straight from Soviet design principles. developed 3 decades earlier. The A-10's 30mm dual-weight Avenger cannon was designed to destroy Soviet tanks in a potential World War III scenario. But the tactics for employing it, low-altitude approaches, multiple passes over targets, mutual support between aircraft, these were refined versions of the Circle of Death and other tactics Soviet pilots had developed through bitter experience on the Eastern Front. Even the A-10's nickname, Warthog, echoes the blunt utilitarian nature of the Sturmovik. Neither aircraft won beauty contests. Both were designed for a single purpose: survive in hostile environments and destroy ground targets. Aesthetics were irrelevant. Function was everything. The IL-2's influence extended beyond hardware into doctrine and training. Post-war Soviet military academies taught combined arms warfare with close air support as a fundamental element. Forward air controllers became permanent fixtures in ground units. Communications equipment for air-ground coordination was standardized. Exercises rehearsed the procedures until they became second nature. When Western military analysts finally got access to Soviet tactical manuals in the 1950s and 60s, they were surprised by how sophisticated the air-ground integration doctrine had become. The Soviets had learned lessons during World War II that Western militaries were still struggling with. The IL-2 operational experience had been distilled into institutional knowledge. Individual Sturmovik pilots who survived the war became legends in Soviet military culture. Some achieved ace status, not through aerial combat but through the sheer number of ground attack missions flown. A pilot who completed 100 Sturmovik sorties had demonstrated exceptional skill and extraordinary luck. Those who reached 200 missions were heroes whose names were known across the military. Anna Yegorova, the female pilot captured in Poland, survived German captivity despite severe burns and wounds. After liberation, she was actually imprisoned by Soviet authorities under suspicion of collaboration. This was not uncommon. Stalin's paranoia meant that Soviet POWs were often treated as traitors regardless of circumstances. Yegorova spent years in Soviet camps before being rehabilitated after Stalin's death. She never flew again but remained proud of her service as a Sturmovik pilot. Her story highlights the bitter reality behind Soviet victory. The IL-2 pilots who survived German guns sometimes fell victim to their own government's suspicions. The industrial workers who built the aircraft often laboured in conditions barely better than slavery. The rear gunners who protected the aircraft had casualty rates that would have been considered unacceptable in Western air forces. The human cost of Soviet victory is sometimes overshadowed by the military achievements. Yes, the Red Army defeated Nazi Germany. Yes, Soviet industry performed miracles of production, but these victories were purchased with suffering on a scale difficult for modern readers to comprehend. Every IL-2 sortie represented not just a tactical operation, but a human drama of courage, fear, determination, and often death. The statistics we casually cite, 12,000 IL-2s lost, represent 12,000 individual catastrophes. Each aircraft that went down carried 1 or 2 young men who had families waiting at home, who had dreams beyond the war, who wanted to survive and return to normal lives. The majority never did. Their names are inscribed on memorials across the former Soviet Union, if they're remembered at all. Soviet military culture venerated sacrifice in ways that Western observers often found disturbing. A pilot who crashed his damaged aircraft into a German tank column rather than bailing out was celebrated as a hero. A gunner who kept firing until his ammunition was exhausted and his aircraft was shot down was held up as an example. The line between bravery and suicide was often blurred. This mentality enabled the Red Army to sustain losses that would have broken other militaries. But it also meant that Soviet commanders sometimes spent lives carelessly, accepting casualty rates that more humane leadership would have found intolerable. The IL-2 operational history reflects this tension. Brilliant tactics and brave pilots achieving remarkable results, but at a cost in lives that should give us pause even as we admire their accomplishments. The technical evolution of the Sturmovik throughout the war demonstrated the Soviet capacity for incremental improvement under pressure. Each variant addressed specific problems identified in combat. The 2-seat configuration answered the vulnerability to rear attacks. The upgraded cannons provided better armour penetration. The improved engines gave better performance. The PTAB bombs solved the problem of attacking heavily armoured tanks. Soviet designers didn't have the luxury of leisurely development programs. They couldn't withdraw aircraft from service for years of testing and refinement. Improvements had to be implemented quickly, with minimal disruption to production. The fact that they managed this while factories were being evacuated, while raw materials were scarce, while skilled workers were being conscripted for frontline service, is testament to the pragmatism of Soviet engineering culture. German designers, by contrast, often pursued technological perfection at the expense of practicality. The Mi-262 jet fighter was technically superior to any Allied aircraft, but it required rare materials, precision manufacturing, and highly trained pilots. Too few were built too late to affect the war's outcome. The Germans developed wonder weapons that were wonderful but useless because they couldn't be produced in meaningful numbers. The IL-2 was never a wonder weapon. It was a practical weapon designed for mass production and mass employment. In total war, practical beats wonderful every time. This lesson has relevance far beyond World War II. Military procurement today still struggles with the balance between technological sophistication and producibility. The most capable weapons system is worthless if you can't build enough of them, maintain them in the field, and train personnel to use them effectively. The Sturmovik's operational legacy influenced post-war conflicts in ways both obvious and subtle. Soviet military advisors in Korea, Vietnam, and various Middle Eastern conflicts brought with them tactical doctrines developed on the Eastern Front. Forward air controllers, pre-planned strike missions, on-call close air support. These concepts, refined through IL-2 operations, became standard practice. When North Vietnamese forces operated against American troops in the 1960s, their anti-aircraft tactics reflected Soviet training. Concentrate fire, target aircraft during vulnerable moments like low-speed attacks, force them to fly higher where bombing accuracy decreased. American pilots flying close air support missions in Vietnam faced many of the same challenges that Sturmovik pilots had encountered, and the solutions were often similar. Fly faster, attack from multiple directions, don't make predictable repeated passes. The aircraft performing these missions were different. A-1 Sky Raiders and later A-7 Corsairs instead of IL-2s. But the fundamental dynamics of ground attack aviation in contested airspace remained constant. The airplane that flies low enough to attack accurately becomes vulnerable to ground fire. Armour helps, but isn't a complete solution. Tactics matter as much as hardware. Israeli forces in the 1973 Yom Kippur War experienced this reality shockingly. Arab forces, equipped with Soviet anti-aircraft missiles and training, inflicted heavy losses on Israeli aircraft. The Israelis had dominated the skies in previous conflicts, but dense air defences changed the equation. Israeli pilots had to relearn lessons that Sturmovik pilots had learned 30 years earlier. The skies over the battlefield belonged to whoever controlled the air defence umbrella. This led to renewed Western interest in armoured aircraft and sophisticated electronic warfare systems. The A-10 program benefited from these lessons. Modern close air support aircraft carry electronic countermeasures, flare dispensers, and armour precisely because the threat environment hasn't fundamentally changed since 1943. Physics still determines what happens when metal meets metal at high velocity. The IL-2's most lasting legacy might be the proof that specialised aircraft designed for specific missions outperform multi-role compromises. The Sturmovik was purpose-built for ground attack. It couldn't dogfight. It couldn't intercept bombers. It couldn't perform high-altitude reconnaissance. But for its intended mission, destroying ground targets in contested airspace, it was superbly effective. Modern air forces often prefer multi-role fighters that can perform various missions. This makes economic sense and provides operational flexibility. A single aircraft type is cheaper to maintain and easier to train for. But there are missions where specialised capability matters more than flexibility. Close air support in high-threat environments is one of them. The continued operation of A-10s by the US Air Force, despite numerous attempts to retire them, demonstrates this reality. Pilots and ground forces consistently report that specialised close air support aircraft provide capabilities that multi-role fighters struggle to match. The ability to loiter over the battlefield, to carry heavy weapon loads, to survive battle damage. These characteristics define the IL-2 and remain relevant today. The Sturmovik story also illustrates the importance of institutional learning and tactical evolution. The aircraft that entered service in 1941 was nominally the same as the one flying in 1945, but the tactics employed had evolved dramatically. Early IL-2 operations were crude and costly. By war's end, Sturmovik tactics represented sophisticated integration of air and ground operations. This evolution didn't happen automatically. It required analysing combat results, identifying problems, developing solutions, training personnel in new procedures, and refining approaches based on feedback. Soviet military culture, for all its flaws, was capable of this kind of organisational learning under extreme pressure. Modern militaries study this phenomenon extensively. How do you create organisations that learn from experience and adapt rapidly? How do you capture lessons from combat and disseminate them effectively? How do you balance innovation with stability? The IL-2 operational history provides a case study in successful adaptation. The human stories behind the statistics deserve remembering. The factory worker in Kuibyshev who assembled armoured tubs, working 12-hour shifts in unheated facilities during winter. The aircraft was her contribution to victory. The supply officer who ensured ammunition reached forward airfields despite partisan attacks and infrastructure damage. His logistics enabled the missions. The mechanic who repaired battle-damaged aircraft with improvised parts because the supply chain had broken down. His ingenuity kept aircraft flying. War is often described through the actions of leaders and celebrated heroes, but victory or defeat actually depends on thousands of ordinary people performing difficult jobs under terrible conditions. The IL-2 existed because workers built them. It flew because mechanics maintained them. It fought because logistics officers supplied them. And it won because all these elements worked together despite chaos, hardship, and loss. The Sturmovik pilots themselves came from every corner of the Soviet Union. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians, and dozens of other nationalities flew together in the same regiments. The Great Patriotic War was fought by the entire Soviet population, and the IL-2 squadrons reflected that diversity. Some pilots were professionals who had trained in military academies before the war. Others were civilian pilots hastily trained for combat. Some were promoted from ground crew positions because the need for pilots was desperate. The training pipeline expanded and improved throughout the war, but there were always more positions than qualified personnel. This meant that veteran pilots, those who survived their first dozen missions, carried enormous responsibility. They mentored newcomers, led formations, developed the tactics that less experienced pilots would follow. The survival rate for veteran pilots was significantly higher than for newcomers, not just because of skill, but because they understood how to survive in the brutal environment of ground attack operations. The psychological burden on these veterans was immense. They watched replacement pilots arrive, fly a few missions, and die. Sometimes the replacements didn't survive even one mission. The veterans kept flying, kept training the next batch of replacements, knowing that most of them would also die. The emotional toll of this cycle created lasting trauma that many survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Post-war Soviet society didn't provide much support for veterans dealing with psychological wounds. The expectation was that soldiers would simply resume normal lives. But men who had flown combat missions daily for years, who had watched friends die, who carried guilt for surviving when so many didn't, these men struggled. Some managed, many didn't. The human cost of victory extended decades beyond the actual fighting. The IL-2 also played a role in Soviet propaganda and public morale during the war. Newspaper reports celebrated Sturmovik victories. Radio broadcasts described their attacks on German forces. Posters showed the distinctive silhouette of the aircraft. The message was consistent. The Red Army was hitting back. The fascist invaders were being destroyed. This propaganda served important purposes. Soviet citizens needed to believe that victory was possible during the darkest periods of the war. Workers in factories needed motivation to meet production quotas. Soldiers at the front needed confidence in their equipment and support. The IL-2 became a symbol of Soviet resistance and eventual triumph. But propaganda also created unrealistic expectations. Combat reports inflated enemy losses. Heroic narratives omitted the ugly realities of war. The public image of Sturmovik operations bore little resemblance to the desperate, chaotic, and often unsuccessful reality that pilots experienced. This gap between perception and reality created its own problems after the war. The technical specifications of the IL-2 reflected Soviet design priorities in ways that are instructive. The aircraft was never designed to be the fastest, the most maneuverable, or the longest range in its class. Instead, it prioritized survivability, firepower, and producibility. This represented a clear-eyed assessment of Soviet industrial capabilities and operational requirements. Soviet factories could produce the AN-38 engine reliably. They could manufacture steel armor plate. They could build wooden rear fuselages using semi-skilled labor. They couldn't easily produce sophisticated electronics, precision instruments, or complex mechanical systems. The IL-2 was designed around what could actually be built rather than what would be theoretically optimal. This pragmatism extended to pilot ergonomics and aircraft handling. The Sturmovik was not particularly pleasant to fly. Controls were heavy, visibility was limited. The cockpit was cramped and uncomfortable, but it was stable, predictable, and forgiving of pilot errors. For pilots with limited training, these characteristics mattered more than refinement. Western aircraft often prioritize pilot comfort and flying qualities. This made sense when you had well-trained pilots who would fly the aircraft for years. But Soviet pilots often had limited training and short lifespans once they reached combat units. The IL-2's forgiving handling characteristics helped keep inadequately trained pilots alive long enough to gain experience. The ammunition capacity represented another pragmatic choice. The aircraft carried enough ammunition for 2 to 3 attack passes. This aligned with tactical doctrine that emphasized quick strikes rather than extended loitering. Western close air support doctrine often emphasized longer endurance over the battlefield, but Soviet doctrine prioritized getting in, attacking, and getting out before enemy fighters could respond. The rocket armament deserves particular attention because it represented a technological area where Soviet designers led rather than followed. German and American air forces experimented with rockets during the war, but neither integrated them as thoroughly into their ground attack doctrine. The IL-2 was designed from the outset to carry rockets as a primary weapon. The RS-82 and RS-132 rockets were crude by modern standards. Accuracy was poor. The shaped charge warheads, while effective against armor, were inconsistent. But they provided Sturmovik pilots with standoff capability. You could launch rockets from several hundred meters away, outside the effective range of some anti-aircraft weapons. This allowed attacks on heavily defended targets with reduced risk. Modern air-to-ground missiles descended directly from these early rocket weapons. The principle of launching guided or unguided projectiles from standoff range to attack ground targets remained central to close air support. The sophistication has increased dramatically, but the fundamental concept was proven by IL-2 operations in World War II. The PTAB anti-tank bomblets represented another area of Soviet innovation. The concept of dispensing large numbers of small bomblets over an area, rather than dropping a single large bomb, proved remarkably effective. Each IL-2 carrying nearly 200 PTABs could cover a large area, and the shaped charge warheads meant that even near misses could damage or destroy targets. Modern cluster munitions work on the same principle, though with far greater sophistication. The bomblets are guided, the dispersal patterns are controlled, and the warheads are more effective. But the operational concept came directly from the PTAB experience. Soviet weapons designers identified a tactical problem: armored tanks vulnerable only from above, and developed a weapon specifically to exploit that vulnerability. This kind of focused innovation characterized Soviet weapons development during the war. The Soviets weren't trying to develop revolutionary new technologies in most cases. They were identifying specific tactical problems and creating pragmatic solutions that could be produced with available resources and employed by personnel with realistic training levels. The IL-2's operational employment also demonstrated the value of forward air control and close integration between air and ground forces. The VVS developed procedures for ground commanders to request air support that were remarkably efficient given the primitive communications technology available. Radio-equipped vehicles with Air Force liaison officers accompanied advancing ground units. When strong points or enemy concentrations were identified, coordinates were transmitted to nearby airfields. Sturmoviks would launch, fly to the designated area, and attack based on coloured smoke markers or other identification methods. The time from request to attack could be as little as 15 to 20 minutes. This responsiveness gave Soviet ground commanders confidence that air support would be available when needed. That confidence enabled more aggressive tactics. You're more willing to attempt risky maneuvers when you know aircraft can intervene if you encounter unexpected resistance. The psychological impact on Soviet infantry of seeing Sturmoviks overhead, knowing they were there to help, was significant. Conversely, German ground forces increasingly operated without air support as the Luftwaffe declined. The psychological impact of fighting under enemy air dominance, knowing that any concentration of forces might be attacked, restricted German tactical flexibility and degraded combat effectiveness. The mathematics of attrition warfare that favoured the Soviets in aircraft production also applied to pilot training. The Soviet Union established numerous flight schools across its vast territory. As the war progressed and territories were liberated, additional training facilities opened. The pipeline of new pilots expanded continuously. Germany, by contrast, struggled to maintain pilot production. Training facilities required fuel, aircraft, and instructors. All three became increasingly scarce as the war turned against Germany. By 1944, German pilot training had collapsed to the point where new pilots entered combat with dangerously inadequate preparation. Soviet pilots during the same period had significantly better training than their German counterparts. This reversal from the early war situation, when German pilots were far better trained than Soviet pilots, exemplifies how sustained industrial warfare grinds down the side with fewer resources. Germany couldn't simultaneously maintain operations on multiple fronts, defend the homeland against strategic bombing, and train replacements adequately. Something had to give, and pilot training was sacrificed. The IL-2's role in the Soviet advance through Eastern Europe in 1944 and 1945 deserves more detailed examination. As Red Army forces liberated occupied territories and pushed into Germany itself, Sturmovik operations adapted to new challenges. Urban combat required different tactics than open steppes. Fortified positions in German cities were harder to identify and attack than tank columns. IL-2 pilots developed tactics for urban operations, flying slow reconnaissance passes to identify targets, coordinating with artillery spotters, using rockets and cannons against specific buildings where German forces had established strongpoints. The bombing of German cities by strategic bombers gets most historical attention, but Sturmovik strikes in direct support of ground forces fighting street to street were often more militarily significant. The liberation of concentration camps presented Soviet forces, including IL-2 pilots, with the full horror of Nazi atrocities. When Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945, some of the first Soviet forces to arrive included air units that had provided close air support during the advance. What they found shocked even veterans hardened by years of brutal warfare. This discovery reinforced the Soviet narrative that they were fighting a war of extermination against an evil enemy. For IL-2 pilots who might have questioned the cost of their missions, who might have felt sympathy for German soldiers who were, after all, often young conscripts fighting for their country, the evidence of genocide eliminated moral ambiguity. The Great Patriotic War was indeed a struggle for survival against an enemy that had to be destroyed completely. The final battles in Berlin brought the IL-2's combat career full circle. The aircraft that had first seen action in desperate defense of Soviet territory now attacked the enemy capital. Sturmoviks flew missions over the Reichstag, the symbol of Nazi power. They supported Soviet troops fighting through Berlin's streets. They attacked the bunker complex where Hitler spent his final days, though they didn't know he was there. The satisfaction Soviet pilots felt at destroying the Nazi regime in its lair was profound. 4 years earlier, German armies had stood at Moscow's gates. Soviet victory had seemed impossible. Now Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the conquered enemy capital while Sturmovik circled overhead. The transformation was complete. But victory came with sobering realities. The Soviet Union had lost over 27 million people during the war. Cities lay in ruins. The industrial base, while impressive in its wartime production, was exhausted and damaged. The veterans who survived carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The IL-2 pilots who made it through the war had achieved something remarkable, but at a cost that should never be forgotten or minimized. The post-war fate of surviving Sturmoviks was prosaic. Most were scrapped. The Soviet Union needed steel for reconstruction. Aircraft that had saved the nation were cut up and melted down. Some were transferred to Allied nations. A few ended up in remote areas where they sat abandoned until decades later, when historians and collectors began seeking them out. This utilitarian disposal of aircraft that had such historical significance reflects Soviet priorities. Sentiment didn't rebuild destroyed cities. Nostalgia didn't feed hungry populations. The IL-2 had served its purpose. Now its materials were needed elsewhere. In a way, this final contribution to Soviet reconstruction was fitting. The aircraft had always been about practical necessity rather than glory. The lessons of the IL-2 story resonate today. Industrial capacity matters in sustained conflict. Tactical evolution through experience is crucial. Specialized equipment designed for specific missions outperforms compromises. Integration of air and ground operations multiplies effectiveness. These principles remain valid in modern warfare. The human dimension remains equally important. The courage of ordinary people asked to perform extraordinary tasks under terrible conditions. The sacrifice of those who didn't survive. The determination of those who kept going despite losses. The ingenuity of those who solved problems with inadequate resources. These qualities determined the outcome of the war as much as any technology or strategy. When you read accounts of the IL-2 Sturmovik and see the impressive statistics, 36,000 produced, thousands of missions flown, remember that each sortie represented human beings climbing into an aircraft knowing they might not return. Remember the factory workers who built them despite hunger and exhaustion. Remember the mechanics who kept them flying, despite damaged facilities and parts shortages. Remember the pilots and gunners who died over snow-covered fields and burning cities. The IL-2 was indeed as essential to the Red Army as air and bread, as Stalin claimed. But it was also the product of Soviet determination to survive at any cost. The aircraft itself was remarkable, but the system that created it, employed it, and sustained it through 4 years of brutal warfare was even more so. That system had terrible flaws, inflicted suffering on its own people, and made choices that prioritized victory over humanity. Yet, it defeated Nazi Germany. The IL-2 Sturmovik Black Death, the flying tank, was both instrument and symbol of that victory. Its thunder echoed across the Eastern Front from Moscow to Berlin, carrying a message the Wehrmacht ultimately couldn't resist. The Soviet Union would not be conquered. Its people would endure, its industry would produce, its forces would advance, and the price of invasion would be total destruction. That message, delivered by thousands of Sturmovik sorties over 4 years of war, changed history. The aircraft that German soldiers initially dismissed became the weapon they feared most. The sound of those Mikulin engines became synonymous with Soviet victory and German defeat. And 75 years later, that sound still echoes in the collective memory of the nations that fought the largest and most terrible war in human history.